Yes, Tom.
Oh,
Ross.
okay. All right. This is a presentation, a webinar of the Center for Future Consciousness. And I'm Tom Lombardo, the director of the Center for Future Consciousness. And this webinar is the final installment in an ongoing series on the evolution of science fiction. This, in fact, is module 19. And this final webinar is Summary, Conclusions, and Prospectus on the Evolution of Science Fiction. And I thought as an appropriate quotation to put up here to begin with, from the great Golden Age science fiction writer Lester Del Rey, even the devoted aficionado or fan has a hard time trying to explain what science fiction is. And that the reason for there not being a full satisfactory definition is that there are no easily delineated limits to science fiction. And in fact, that's part of the essence or nature of science fiction, that it is continually, or at least regularly, stretching its own limits beyond where it was before. And we'll come back to that at the end when we talk about the future of science fiction. But the outline for today, I'm going to go over the main topics and themes of science fiction, best science fiction novels and most noteworthy authors in science fiction, the values and purposes of science fiction. Why is science fiction the evolutionary mythology of the future? An idea that I explain and have gone into in significant depth throughout the various webinars. Science fiction and the purposeful evolution of consciousness in the future, how science fiction is involved in that, and then finally talk about the future evolution of science fiction. Now, I sent everybody an outline for the presentation today because there is a great amount of information that I'm going to be going over in the next 2 hours. And the outline would be helpful if you want to follow along and look on your outline as I'm talking about the different topics today. And then you have a record later on if you want to go back to it and you want to look at what I discussed under each of the topics and themes or authors or novels. So you have that as a reference. So everybody should have gotten one. It's a PDF file. As I mentioned, this is a presentation of the Center for Future Consciousness, and the mission is to advance the purposeful evolution of humanity, involving the heightening of future consciousness and wisdom and the inspirational, mythic, and cosmic power of science fiction. And I have up there the URL for the website. And if you're interested in reading any of my articles, all my articles are up on the website, as well as lots and lots of videos and various audio interviews I've put up there as well, too. Quickly want to mention, I have a newsletter. There's a YouTube channel. All the previous science fiction webinars are up there, as well as lots of other webinars and presentations, videos on consciousness and on the future. They're all on my YouTube channel, the Center for Future Consciousness channel. Here's just a quick visual display of my books that don't directly have to do with science fiction, but have to do with the future, future consciousness, consciousness psychology, virtue. But 3 other books that I have published specifically have to do with the history of science fiction, volumes 1, 2, and 3 of Science Fiction, the Evolutionary Mythology of the Future. And I should mention that the webinar series that I'm doing is being done in conjunction with writing out a history of science fiction, which at the moment I've published 3 volumes, but there's actually 3 more volumes to go in the series. All of these other volumes I've discussed on the webinars. And today, actually, what I'm going to be talking about will be the concluding part of the last of the 6 volumes, Hyperion, the Singularity, and Beyond. So there's a book series, and there's also the webinars as well. And I should also mention, in case you're interested, I have compressed articles on the history of science fiction. If you want to email me, I could send you copies. Recently, I did another article, which will be coming out in Compass Magazine, on science fiction novels all futurists should read. And there's also a video up, one of the videos in the series, that's a accelerative history of science fiction as well, too. So there's lots of resources, both printed and videos, on my work on the evolution of science fiction. As I mentioned today, we're going to be doing kind of a summary. And one of the areas that I'm going to be covering is on the different major topics, themes, and archetypes even in science fiction. And something that I've mentioned before is that, contrary to the popular stereotype that science fiction is primarily about science and technology, science fiction is actually about the future of everything, life, the universe, and everything, to quote Douglas Adams. And so I'm going to highlight out the different major areas, topics that science fiction has addressed, and I'm going to put up a number of different novels or stories that fall under each of these categories. Now, there's so many stories, so many novels that I'm going to mention that I really can't go into any much depth with it, but I want you to get a sense of the breadth and the depth of science fiction in terms of the different kinds of areas and themes that it covers. Now, the place I'm going to begin is with science fiction stories that involve extraordinary adventures into the mysterious, wondrous, and unknown. And I put this one first because, excuse me, the origins of science fiction and myth actually go back to this kind of narrative, adventures into fantastical, wondrous, mysterious realities. And just to give you a sense, the first science fiction novel, Lucian's True History, was an adventure to the moon. Kepler's story, Somnium, the Dream, was also an adventure up to the moon. And back in the 18th century, The Journey of Niels Klim was an adventure into the interior of the Earth. But you can go on adventures all over the place. Jules Verne went back to the center of the Earth. 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea was an adventure through the oceans. Off on a Comet was an adventure going out into outer space with a number of human characters who are on a comet on a piece of a chunk of the Earth. Other ones that are noteworthy, going into the interior of the Earth, the Moon Pool, A Journey in Other Worlds, Adventuring Out to the Planets, Lumen by Camille Flammarion. These are classic old works that were cases of going on adventures. The Nightland, which was an adventure across an far future Earth, The Lost World. Distant Worlds, which was the first interstellar adventure to other stars in space. And these are novels I've mentioned before. These are all classic early stuff. Adventures in Time with the Time Machine, Adventure Again to the Moon. Colossus, which came out in Astounding Stories, which was an adventure dealing with moving up through levels of pop. What is that? Something boom, 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 boom. Okay, be that as it may. Edgar Rice Burroughs wrote lots of adventures into the interior of the Earth, exploring Mars, going up and having adventures on Venus. Moving forward, Star Maker went through the entire universe. A Martian Odyssey, a great adventure on the surface of Mars. The Voyage of the Space Beagle, which is an adventure involving contacting different aliens written back in the 1940s. As you can see, it just goes on and on. Lovecraft at a Mountain of Madness, Surface Tension, which I had talked about earlier. The Fabulous Riverboat, which is an adventure on this giant river circling around this planet. Son of Man, which is an adventure into the future, and more, all the way up to the present, where we have things like the Tower of Babylon, the Scar, Shill's Ladder, which is an adventure into other universes, the City in the Middle of the Night, which is a great adventure on another planet, and that I had mentioned during the earlier discussion, Children of Ruin, which is an outer space adventure involving interactions with various types of strange life forms. So adventures can take place all over the place, both in space and in time, going into the interior of the Earth, going to other planets, going into other dimensions. And that's been a key theme throughout science fiction, is travel to some strange place, encounter strange sights, interact with strange beings, perhaps move through time as well as through space, or move into other dimensions. Now, a second main theme that we see in science fiction is scientific and technological discovery, advancement, and invention. And this covers multiple areas of science and brings in the emotional elements of hope for fantastical technologies and fears of technology as well, too. And stories about science and technology go all the way back to Francis Bacon with the New Atlantis, and being fearful of technology and science in Frankenstein and Erewhon, being positive about science and technology with Gernsback and Montezega. John Campbell, The Mightiest Machine, is a really good 1930s book on space technology. Nat Shackner wrote a number of different books exploring science and stories involving science and technology. The Humanoids by Jack Williamson is a classic book, not just simply on robots, but on the search for a deep scientific understanding of the universe. And then more contemporary books, which I think have a strong scientific technological emphasis, are David Brin's Earth, where scientists create black holes. I mentioned Shill's Ladder already, by Greg Egan, which has a lot of really deep science in it. Scientific Cosmology with Manifold Time by Stephen Baxter, Nanotechnology, Neil Stevenson, and of course there's lots of others. But this is only one slice of science fiction, but clearly science fiction gets into the possibilities of advancing science and advancing technologies. Now, in particular, science fiction has frequently got into AI, computer intelligence, robotic intelligence, technological intelligence, and I put this up as a separate category because, in fact, there's so much in the history of science fiction about computers and robots, starting with the Sandman, which is back in the 19th century, the creation of a female robot by Thomas Edison in Tomorrow's Eve, John Campbell's The Last Evolution, which is a story about how robots and artificial intelligence will be the next step forward in evolution on the Earth. about problems with technology, and the machine stops, falling in love with a robot, Helen O'Loy, and Isaac Asimov's famous series of stories written in the 1940s, collected in I, Robot. And Asimov in particular has been well known for his stories on robotic intelligence. And in fact, moving into the 1950s, Asimov wrote a series of novels on a robot detective working with a human partner. The robot series, The Caves of Steel, I think was the best one. Poul Anderson wrote a very interesting story about artificial intelligence and technological life in Epilogue, where it is in fact the machines that inherit the earth. It's not a novel, and it might be a little difficult to find, but it's frequently reprinted in anthologies, and it's a good story to read on envisioning the far future on the earth, where biological life is gone and it's been replaced by mechanical life. More recently, we have lots of stuff on robots, making love with robots, in the Weird Trilogy, passing the singularity in Accelerando, Snow Crash, which is a great story on virtual reality, Schismatrix by Bruce Sterling, which compares biotechnological enhancement with computer enhancement of humans, virtual reality in Ready Player One, the web becoming conscious in Robert Sawyer's wake. So there's been lots of different stories throughout history on robots, intelligence, artificial intelligence, and computer intelligence in general. The next thing I have up here, science fiction gets into this topic too: the future evolution of life, humanity and nature, the environment and ecology, and some early stuff that gets into speculations that are biological in nature. Of course, there's The Island of Dr. Moreau by Wells, experimenting with life. Seeds of Life, John Taine, which also gets into how one can enhance life technologically. War with the Newts, which is a very significant and funny novel on interacting with intelligent newts on the earth. The future evolution of the ecology of the earth in Hot House. The ecological novella, The Word for World is Forest by Ursula Gwen, and Animal-Human Hybrids in Australia, which is a really great novel of the Silver Age by Cornwainer Smith. More recently, we have nanotechnology merging with biological life in Blood Music, technologically enhanced life forms such as techno-enhanced dolphins and chimps and gorillas in Star Tide Rising by David Brin, a grand panoramic vision of the evolution of life, and particularly the evolution of humans from deep in the past to the future in Evolution by Stephen Baxter. Kim Stanley Robinson's Mars Trilogy is really great on a detailed and thoughtful discussion of how one would go about terraforming Mars and creating life on Mars. Robinson is one of the most vocal environmental, ecological science fiction writers, most recently expressing his ideas about transforming the environment in The Ministry of the Future, and two really great novels on technological, purposeful evolution of intelligent life forms in Children of Time and Children of Ruin, which I think are two of the best novels on evolution and life in the history of science fiction by Adrian Tchaikovsky. And of course, science fiction has gone into outer space, exploring it, colonizing it, engineering it, in fact. And there's a long history of this, going all the way back to Kepler again. And I also mentioned John Jacob Astor's A Journey in Other Worlds and Distant Worlds. Those are some of the early ones on outer space exploration. Doc Smith in the Skylark series and in the Lensman series travels across the galaxies, out of the galaxies, lots of adventure going on, lots of exploration going on through outer space in his novels. Stapleton and Starmaker, which I've mentioned before, literally journeys through the entire universe by the time the novel is over. A great shorter piece, though, Robert Heinlein's Universe, about a generation ship that is on a journey from the Earth to some far distant planet to colonize and settle it. And it's a really excellent discussion of living on a spaceship for generations and generations and what happens to the people who live on that spaceship. More recent outer space exploration, Paul Anderson's Tau Zero, which journeys across the universe to the end of time. Ringworld, where we encounter this giant, immense ring that circles a star. Alistair Reynolds has written lots of good space exploration novels, including Revelation Space and House of Suns. Bernard Vinci's Galactic Level of Fire Upon the Deep. More recently, we have Neil Stephenson's Seven Eves, and there's, of course, lots of other ones. And I should just mention at this point in time, as you're looking at these slides and thinking about each of these topics, as a science fiction reader, if you know of other books, other stories that fall into these categories, I'd be interested in, hearing from you on them. You could put them up in the chat room. You can email them to me because, of course, there's lots more than this 15 novels I have up here, for example, on outer space travel and exploration. I did a whole webinar on alien intelligence and alien civilizations, which has been a big theme in science fiction, on contact with them, invasion, communication, the horror element. And when I went back and looked at it, found there's an incredible amount of stuff in science fiction on aliens. Again, going all the way back to Lucian encountering beings of the moon and the sun, and Voltaire and Micromagus, where aliens from Saturn and Ceres visit us. The aliens invade us in War of the Worlds. Edgar Rice Burroughs encounters aliens on Mars and on the moon. Lovecraft encounters all kinds of hideous aliens in his various stories, like at the Mountains of Madness and The Whisper in Darkness. The famous alien encounter, Who Goes There? And then there's other ones. Stapleton and Doc Smith again, and they're exploring outer space, encounter lots of different kinds of aliens. Hal Clement and Mission of Gravity, we have aliens that exist on a planet of supergravity, which move very low to the ground and are like centipedes. Solaris, where the planet is an alien. Titan, where we have a lot of strange aliens. Uplift Wars got lots of excellent aliens in it too. And the list would go on and on with that one as well. But aliens have been a big theme in science fiction. Contacting them, communicating with them. Embassy Town, which is a real excellent novel on attempting to communicate with aliens. And a lot of these aliens fall under the horror genre, like The War of the Worlds and The Metal Monster and At the Mountains of Madness, where the aliens are hideous and are out to eat us and kill us or whatever, conquer us. Now, a theme in science fiction that lots of people find very interesting, distinctive to science fiction, is stories dealing with time travel. And of course, we go back to The Time Machine by H.G. Wells, But another early excellent time travel story was The Legion of Time by Jack Williamson, involving time wars, where beings move back and forth through time. Mental time travel comes up in The Shadow Out of Time and Last and First Men. L. Sprague de Camp's Lest Darkness Fall. A man from contemporary times goes back to ancient Rome and attempts to change the course of history, which is a theme that comes up in time travel. If you can move into the past, can you change the course of history? In the 1940s and 50s, we had lots of really good time travel stories. I talked about Biased Bootstraps and All You Zombies by Heinlein. Vintage Season, talked about quite a while ago, where people from the future come back to observe natural disasters, like they're tourists in time. Bring the Jubilee, where time travel changes the outcome of the Civil War. And The Big Time and the End of Eternity, which came out in the 1950s, which involve manipulations of time from outside of time. Very good novels, both of them written around the same time. Behold the Man, where a man goes back in a time machine in search of Christ. The Man Who Folded Himself, where a man using a time belt is able to be his mother and father and daughter and son. And Morlock Nights, where the Morlocks from H.G. Wells' Time Machine come back from the future into the present and try to conquer the present. So we have time traveling Morlocks in Morlock Night. More recently, Connie Willis has done lots of excellent stories and novels on time travel, including To Say Nothing of the Dog and the Doomsday Book. Michael Bishop's No Enemy But Time, where a man goes back to the distant past and falls in love with a prehistoric woman and brings her back to the present. I think the best time travel novel has been Stephen Baxter's The Time Ships, which is a continuation or sequel to Wells' The Time Machine, and starts up exactly where the time machine ends and becomes a great cosmic adventure through going back and forth through time, traveling through multiverses, and going to the end of the universe of all universes. More recently, we have a classic kind of time travel story in Ted Chiang's The Merchant and the Alchemist's Gate, where we have a time traveler who tries to improve his reality by manipulating the past, and every time he does so, it seems to backfire on him. So if you think you can go back in the past and change it so things come out better, that doesn't necessarily work itself out. But time travel has been a big theme in science fiction. Science fiction coming down to earth has gotten into numerous visions of both dystopian and utopian societies. You can go back to New Atlantis by Francis Bacon, an early classic utopia looking backward. Jules Verne's Paris in the 20th Century, which is a dystopian vision. Herland, which is a utopian vision of a society that's populated entirely with women and ruled by women, and is much better than male-dominated societies. Wells got into dystopia and utopian visions with dystopian Sleeper Awakes and utopian The Shape of Things to Come. So that's something. In fact, Wells wrote quite a few utopian novels. In the early part of the 20th century, we had lots of dystopias. We had We and the Messiah of the Cylinder, a Christian science fiction novel, City of Endless Night, which is an anticipation as well as Swastika Night of a authoritarian German dystopia emerging in the 20th century. And then we have Brave New World and Metropolis, So in the early part of the 20th century, lots of dystopias. And moving forward, we have other very good dystopias, Fahrenheit 451, The Long Tomorrow, a commercialism dystopia in The Space Merchants, and of course, 1984 by George Orwell. More recently, we continue to have dystopias like Octavia Butler's two parable novels, The Handmaid's Tale, A Boy and His Dog, Thomas Dish's 334. So dystopias, at least more recently, have become a more popular a theme than utopias in science fiction. And definitely in the last century, we've seen a lot of very well-known dystopias being written by a number of different people. Science fiction often creates intricate worlds involving all different facets and aspects of human society, not necessarily dystopian or utopian, but attempting to fabricate a very complete, in-depth vision of societies or worlds in the future, beginning with Albert Rabida, the 20th century, The Dying Earth, far distant future world building, Cornwainer Smith, who I mentioned before, with his intricate vision of the future, and of course, Last and First Men by Olaf Stapleton, creating a very complete picture of humanity over the next couple of billion years. Other significant world-building future societies are Dune, Stand on Zanzibar, which is very intricate and rich vision of the future, The Dispossessed by Ursula Le Guin. Hyperion is one of the best examples. I have up here just the first two volumes, Hyperion, The Fall of Hyperion, of a very rich social, technological, psychological, religious vision of the future. Kim Stanley Robinson in the Mars trilogy creates a multifaceted vision of Martian society evolving over the next few decades. Neil Stephenson in The Diamond Age and an Anthem does really excellent job of envisioning these complete realities, these societies, with all different aspects taken into account. I've mentioned Ian MacDonald before, River of Gods, The Dervish House, which are superb, relatively contemporary novels dealing with a future India, a future Istanbul, and I also mentioned recently Central Station, which is a very rich picture world of a kind of ambiguous future in terms of its time. But science fiction writers often create these complete, comprehensive visions of the future in a future world, a future society in their novels. There's been lots written on the future of crime and war, all the way back to the Battle of Dorking and the Angel of the Revolution and Edison's conquest of Mars and the war in the air. War has been a frequent theme in science fiction. On crime, early things would be the Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde and the Invisible Man, dealing with criminals and dealing with law enforcement and people attempting to capture and hunt down criminal minds that in some way or other are strange or different. Lots of wars took place during the 1930s and 1940s in science fiction, usually in outer space. John Campbell, Doc Smith with the Chronicles of Lensman, Edmund Hamilton with the Interstellar Patrol, these three writers in particular really got into describing these incredibly vast, extensive, ferocious wars, often between humans and other aliens, taking place in outer space. And this is during a period where war was something which was on everybody's mind globally, moving toward World War II and just coming out of World War I. So there's been lots of war novels, often in outer space. The 30s and the 40s had a lot of them. On the crime end, Private Eye by Kuttner and Moore is an excellent story about a criminal trying to commit a perfect crime when we have a police system that's able to watch everything that's ever happened. The Demolished Man, a guy trying to commit a perfect crime where the police are telepathic. And finally, Fahrenheit, which is a criminal android. More recently, on the war end, three famous ones have been Starship Troopers, then Joe Haldeman's response to Starship Troopers in the Forever War, and then John Scalzi's, inspired by Starship Troopers, Old Man's War. So in more recent times, we've had newer novels come out talking about war. Newer novels coming out talking about crime and criminal investigation and hunting down criminals in Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep and Queen of Angels, which is an excellent novel on psychology and psychopathology, technologically enhanced criminal and therapeutic investigations. And then even more recent, we have Baxter's War That Lasts the Entire Length of the Universe and the Zeeley Saga. So war and crime have been there in science fiction too. Now, turning more toward the psychological humanistic, even though it's not generally in a stereotypical way associated with science fiction, there's been lots of stuff on the future evolution of humanity, the future of the mind, the future of the self, the future of consciousness. And we can go all the way back to Bueller-Lytton's The Coming Race, Advanced Humans, and Wells' Men Like Gods, an antecedent of Superman, Philip Wiley's Gladiator, Stapleton's Odd John and Last and First Men, which also deal with the future evolution of humans, more intelligent humans arising now or in the future. Beresford, which inspired Stapleton's Odd John the Wonder. A good 1930s pulp vision of the technologically augmented evolution of humans and minds is Creatures of the Light. And if anybody's interested in reading that one, I can give you a reference on it. But that's an interesting take by a woman science fiction writer, Sophie Ellis. Moving into the 1930s and 1940s, Heinlein wrote some good stuff, Waldo and Beyond This Horizon on mental psychological evolution. Schachner, again, wrote some good stuff on psychological human evolution, The Isotope Men and Crystallized Thought. A very famous one, though, of that period was von Vox Slan. And then 10 years later, Sturgeon's More Than Human about Homo Gestalts, where groups of people develop into a singular conscious mind. Also, moving into the 1950s, Paul Anderson, Call Me Joe, a technologically altered human who lives on Jupiter, the future evolution of intelligence on the Earth, including humans, through cosmic events, brainwave, Childhood Zen, where aliens technologically enhance our consciousness, the very famous Flowers for Algernon, where an idiot is turned into a genius. Again, surface tension, where humans are genetically redesigned to be tiny little aquatic creatures swimming in a puddle of water, which is a very interesting little story. Moving up into the next couple of decades, diaspora is really great on the evolution of humans into the far future. Darwin's Radio is also very good on that. Son of Man is very psychedelic about the future evolution of humans. And I also put up here Watchmen because Dr. Manhattan is a scientific, technologically enhanced superhuman in that superhero story. And then more recently, Seven Eves about technological enhancement and modification of humans. And Ted Chiang's Understand, which is in the first volume of his collected stories, which is one of the best descriptions I've seen of what a super intelligent human, their consciousness would be like. So lots of stuff on human evolution and conscious evolution throughout science fiction's history. There's been a number of things written on gender, women and men, love and sex in science fiction. In fact, I mentioned Herland already. I haven't mentioned, though, another early science fiction writer, Leslie Francis Stone, who wrote one of the first feminist science fiction, anti-patriarchal science fiction stories, The Conquest of Gola. And but she also wrote Women with Wings and other stories as well, during a period when most women couldn't get into getting their science fiction published at all. Stapleton talks about the future of sex and sex and love with intelligent dogs in Cirrus and in Last Men in London. And Stapleton definitely was someone who didn't shy away from thinking about sex and thinking about relationships, sexual relationships between humans and other creatures or men and women in the future. Catherine Moore, who I've mentioned already from Kuttner and Moore, wrote a number of interesting stories on female aliens, such as in Shamblu, who was a Medusa, a retelling of the Garden of Eden story and the story of Lilith and Fruit of Knowledge, and the Black God's Kiss. In fact, even though some people will say there wasn't any sex in science fiction prior to the 50s and 60s, Catherine Moore would be the exception that perhaps proves the rule, because Catherine Moore did talk about sex and did talk about women and talk about sexual relationships between men and women way, way back in the 1930s and 40s. The person though is usually credited with bringing sex into science fiction was Philip Jose Farmer. And The Lovers, Flesh, and Strange Relations are three very entertaining books written by him, which deal with sex with aliens and sexual enhancement and various other kinds of sexual themes, sometimes involving aliens. And very entertaining books and interesting. And they were written, in the 1950s and 1960s. More recently, we have James Chiptree, who's written a lot on women in science fiction, stories, The Women Men Don't See, The Girl Who Was Plugged In, on gender issues, Ursula Gwen's The Left Hand of Darkness. So, what some people often say is the most significant feminist science fiction novel, The Female Man by Joanna Russ, which is multiple realities with different types of females and different kinds of relationships between men and women across different realities. And then there's a whole series that came out back of the last few decades on Women of Wonder, women science fiction writers writing about women. And in fact, I think I had mentioned to you previously that women have achieved a much stronger voice And in science fiction over the last 10, 20 years, and frequently the characters in these novels they've written about, the central characters are women, and the calculating stars being a good example of a novel dealing with male prejudice and chauvinism, and with women trying to achieve a sense of significance and voice in space exploration. And the weird tetralogy, which I mentioned previously, is very comical and funny regarding ways to enhance sex, both through having sex with robots and having various drugs which will allow you to fuse your bodies together. So there's lots of interesting sex that goes on in that series. Of course, science fiction deals with disasters. That's been a common theme. The end of civilization, the end of humanity, the end of the earth, whatever it happens to be. The earliest ones, The Last Man, which was the most depressive novel I ever read, Omega, The End of the World, The Last Days of the World by Camille Flammarion, The Star by H.G. Wells, The Last American, which is a kind of poignant, depressing view of the end of the United States. Disasters were written in the early pulp magazines, such as The Second Deluge, the first deluge being presumably the Noah's Ark scenario. Darkness and Dawn was another very popular disaster novel about civilization on the earth being wiped out. The Purple Cloud was another one. When Worlds Collide was one of the best, I think, disaster novels ever written, which involves the earth being obliterated and humanity on the earth having a relatively short period of time to get the hell off of the earth and escape before all of humanity is destroyed. And The Absolute at Large by Karol Chopik is a very funny and satirical view of the significance of God in creating this incredible worldwide disaster where millions upon millions of people are killed. You got to read it. Okay. In the 1950s, we have lots of novels about the end of the world, coincident with both the dropping of the atomic bomb, the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union, and fears of the future. So we have Earth Abides and City, A Canticle for Leibowitz, which begins after World War III, Tomorrow, which begins right in the middle of World War III, ecological disasters, No Blade of Grass, Earth Abides, where most of humanity is wiped out by a disease, Day of the Triffids, when civilization goes blind, almost everybody, as we're invaded by these strange plant-like things. Moving up, we got The Wanderer, Lucifer's Hammer, a collection of stories, The End of the World and Other Catastrophes. These are back in the 1960s and 1970s. And then we get J.J. Ballard's world disasters in The Drowned World, The Crystal World. So disasters have been with us since the beginnings of science fiction back in the early 19th century with The Last Man up to the present, and continually being reimagined. What would humans do if the world fell apart, if it blew up, got hit by a meteor, blah, blah, blah. And it goes on and on and on. And then finally, Death's End, which is, I'm sorry, spoiler alert, the Three-Body Problem trilogy. One of the significant events toward the end of the trilogy in Death's End is that the earth is obliterated. And what do humans do then? Now, expansive future histories, far futures that go out really, really far in time. Nightland, The Man Who Awoke, both of those I've mentioned already. John Campbell did a couple with very far distant futures, Twilight and Night, which are both very good short stories on strange and unnerving far futures. Olaf Stapleton, of course, went out billions and billions of years into the future in Last and First Men and in Star Maker. Heinlein and Asimov went out pretty far in time. Last Question by Asimov goes out to the end of the universe and the beginning of a new one. And Clark got into the far distant future and the city and the stars. Gene Wolfe in his great multi-volume saga of the Shadow of the Torturer and the Claw of the Conciliator, and through 5 novels, envisions a very far distant future where there's both magic and science and technology mixed together. And then Stephen Baxter, who I brought in already, envisions an entire saga of our present universe out into the future, involving a great battle between matter and antimatter. So very far distant futures. Religion, God, spirituality, wisdom, and enlightenment come up. I've mentioned The Man Who Awoke and Chopik's comical vision of God and religion, The Absolute Large. One of the most philosophical, introspective science fiction novels ever written was Cirrus, which involves a dog, intelligent dog, contemplating the meaning of its existence. Star Maker is, of course, extremely philosophical and spiritual, in quotes, where the combined intelligence of the universe meets the Star Maker at the end of the novel. And the Christian trilogy by C.S. Lewis, Out of the Silent Planet, et cetera, which involves a outer space saga where all of the characters in it, usually aliens, are really just mass versions of central characters in Christian theology. A Case of Conscience about intelligent beings that don't believe in God. A Canticle for Leibowitz, where the entire story, a lot of it takes place in a monastery in the future. I've mentioned Behold the Man, about a guy in search of Christ. Stranger in a Strange Land, the creation of a new religion. The Deathbird, another retelling of the Garden of Eden. Roger Zelazny's Lord of Light, involving the Hindu gods and the Buddha transformed and made real through technological enhancement. And Dune, which is another Messiah tale. In fact, there's often Messiah characters in lots of science fiction. On Wisdom and Enlightenment, the Ender series, and again, Gene Wolfe's The Book of the New Sun series. In the Hyperion series, the Hyperion Cantos, we have the theme of, would you choose to be immortal if you had to sell your soul to the devil? And the Catholic Church becoming the dominant force on the globe. And in the end, we have a second coming who was a girl, and that's achieved through time travel. 2 really good ones on wisdom and a good one, excuse me, not 2. A very good one on the search for wisdom and enlightenment is Brittle Innings, which is a retelling of Frankenstein, and then another one that's good with respect to attempting to look at the relationship between the magical and the scientific, All the Birds in the Sky. And we have alternate histories going beyond science fiction, going beyond the future, but dealing with other realities, other histories, of the multiverse and the nature of reality altogether. And there's lots of stuff on this. Let's see, which ones did The Orber Probability and the Living Equation. Those stories by Schachner get into manipulating the laws of nature and of mathematics. Mimsy Where the Boar Grows is an alternate reality story. The Dreams in the Witch House by Lovecraft is an alternate dimension story. The Library of Babel, you got to read it to understand it. Very fascinating book about reality. What if werewolves and vampires had a naturalistic explanation, darker than you think, and an alternate reality that's structured in terms of science fiction stories? What mad universe? Dick frequently questioned the nature of reality, the distinction of reality versus fantasy. In numerous of his novels, Counterclock World, Ubik, The Man in the High Castle, which is an alternate history. We have strange alternate realities in The Female Man, Into Your Scattered Bodies Go. We have a world with Egyptian gods in the Anubis Gates, and what I think is the best steampunk novel, Infernal Devices, where we have all kinds of strange and interesting ideas about reality and what reality is made up out of in that novel. And then we got a lot of recent stuff, okay? I haven't mentioned Brazil by MacDonald, which is the third of his intercultural books, which is alternate reality centering around Brazil. Haven't mentioned Ilium, which is a science fiction novel in which we find ourselves on Mars with the Greeks sieging Troy. Red Shirts, where we find ourselves in a science fiction TV show and didn't know we were in a TV show. We thought it was all real. And China Millville's alternate realities like Perdido Street Station and The Scar. So that's a good place to take a little break for the second. Okay, welcome back for the second half of Module 19. On the sections that I just went through on topics and themes, I apologize for rushing through them, but there is quite a bit to cover with tons and tons of novels and stories for each of the categories. And you can go back and look at the outline that I sent to all of you if you want to look at it a little more closely and without a sense of rush under each category, and think about those different topics that science fiction covers. Just in general to note that science fiction pretty much covers the future of everything, and then it covers even more than that because it goes off into alternate realities too. But everything is there, from the science technological to the philosophical to the spiritual and religious to the biological and the ecological and the social. So science fiction gets into all the different dimensions of human reality, in fact, reality in general. Now, I just thought I'd put up here, as I said I was going to, what do I think are the best science fiction novels of all time? You can go look at my list up on the website, but I just thought I'd put them up here and just briefly explain that I tried to sample and read science fiction from all different eras. So I think the list I have up here is fairly comprehensive in terms of the entire time span of science fiction, going all the way back to Lucian, in fact, in ancient times. And this is based on, you could read about what I consider the main criteria for evaluating science fiction novels, but this is 21 through 42. I put up 42 on the list. And I should note, Alfred Bester's two great novels are 21 and 22 up there, and the Foundation trilogy, Greg Bear's Queen of Angels, Ursula Gwen, All the Birds in the Sky, Kim Stanley Robinson, one of the two novels I mentioned by Tchaikovsky, Children of Ruin, The Man Who Awoke, which I think is an excellent 1930s novel, The 20th Century by Rabida, which I think is maybe the pretty close to one of the two best science fiction novels of the 19th century, one of Ian McDonald's, one of China Miéville's, The Nightland, which is very strange and bizarre, and to read it is a real trip about this very distant future Earth. That's 21 through 42. But my top 20 science fiction novels are Star Maker because it's so cosmic, so expansive, so inventive, so imaginative, with aliens, philosophical discussions, the evolution of intelligence, for rich detail in literary quality, Hyperion, City by Clifford Simak, Mechanical for Leibowitz. I have old Stapleton again at number 5. For Last and First Men, The Time Machine. Neil Stephenson, I have up here several times. The one I rate as the best one by him, an anthem, but I also have up The Diamond Age, and somewhere a little bit further down, I have up Snow Crash as well, too. The best new wave science fiction novel I thought was Stand on Zanzibar. China Miéville I have up a couple times, with Perdido Street Station being one of them. Stephen Baxter I have up a couple times too, with The Time Ships and Vacuum Diagrams. And Kim Stanley Robinson I have up a couple times with the Mars Trilogy, and on the earlier list there, Ministry of the Future. I have up Children of Time, which is one of the best of the last 10 years. And his Adrian Tchaikovsky's story about intelligent spiders, the very impressive brittle innings. And if you haven't read that about baseball in the 1930s and a retelling of the Frankenstein story. And I have the incredible Accelerando up here, which most people who read it really love it, about the next 100 years as technology passes through the singularity and usurps humanity's dominion over the Earth, in fact, the solar system. And I forgot if I mentioned, I have up here all 3 of those novels by Ian McDonald, Brazil being at 19, River Gods at 12, and Dervish House being a little bit further down. I think those are 3 great intricate world building, imaginative visions of the future. And in Brazil, we have a vision of alternate realities and alternate Brazils. So that's my list of the best science fiction novels of all time. And so if I was recommending to people what to read, I would say, well, here's a list of what I think are very good ones. And of course, people may have different orders, different books that they would put on their lists. And I think it's temporally balanced. I think there's classic stuff, middle stuff, and late stuff all mixed together through the list. And I have the 3-body problem up there as well. Now, for notable authors, and I refer you to my outline because there's just so many, early notable authors in science fiction. I have about 25 up here, from Mary Shelley and Jules Verne and Edgar Allan Poe and Flammarion and Rabida, up through Chopik and Fritz Lang and his wife Thea von Harbo, Edgar Rice Burroughs, who was the most popular fantasy science fiction writer of the 1920s, Abraham Merritt, who wrote very, very vivid and graphic, strange stuff. Olaf Stapleton, of course, and Doc Smith with his colossal space operas. Edmund Hamilton with his space operas. Nat Schachner, who in the 1930s wrote a dozen really excellent science fiction stories. I've mentioned some of them. H.P. Lovecraft, if you've never read him, is somebody you just got to read because he's so creepy and so intricate and so revolting. And John Campbell, coming to the end of this period, and Campbell, who became the editor of Astounding Magazine, wrote a lot of very good science fiction back in the 1930s when he was in his 20s. And Clark Ashton Smith, who was a very poetic and lyrical science fiction writer of short stories and was best friends with Lovecraft. And I talked about that in more depth back in that section of the webinar. The middle period, from the 40s up to 1980s, perhaps the most popular of that period was Robert Heinlein. He just was a very excellent writer, just wrote a lot of good stories, a lot of good novels, won an incredible number of awards. The first noteworthy husband and wife team, Catherine Moore and Henry Kuttner, back from the 1930s and 1940s, Alfred Bester, Cornwainer Smith, very colorful. Another noteworthy early woman science fiction writer, Lee Brackett. Philip Dick gets more scholarly attention than almost anybody else does, although he was really crazy. But he was a very smart guy and wrote a lot of very bizarre science fiction. J.G. Ballard, who I didn't talk too much about today, was one of the central figures of new wave science fiction. Of course, Isaac Asimov, Roger Zelazny, Robert Silverberg, I didn't talk about too much, but Robert Silverberg wrote an incredible number of really good science fiction novels back in the 1960s and 1970s. Poul Anderson, who I said a little bit about, but was very popular in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, wrote a lot of award-winning stuff. And I end the list with James Tiptree Jr., aka Alice Sheldon, as a new wave science fiction writer who was the mystery writer of science fiction and was very good writing short stories, definitely. Oh, and Arthur C. Clarke, who a lot of people like too. So that's the middle years. We come up to the last 40 years from 1980 to the present. Gene Wolfe's Book of the New Sun series was just fantastic. Joel Haldeman's Forever War, Orson Scott Card with the Ender series, William Gibson as the beginnings of cyberpunk, Bruce Sterling and Rudy Rucker, also cyberpunk. Lois Bujold, who I didn't mention today at all, won lots of awards for her novels. Neil Stevenson, Greg Egan, the most mathematical, scientific, high-powered science fiction writer, except maybe for Stephen Baxter. Greg Bear wrote lots of very good stuff. David Brin. Bernard Vinge, who just died about a week or two ago, wrote some of the classic science fiction novels. Fire Upon the Deep, A Deepness in the Sky, Octavia Butler, Connie Willis, Robert Sawyer, I didn't talk about it all, China Miéville, Ian McDonald, Cory Doctorow, Kim Stanley Robinson, Ted Chiang, Adrian Tchaikovsky, James Corey, who's really two people, and Annie Leckie and Jean Liu, Charles Stross, John Scalzi, more recent, Charlie Jane Anders, who's my favorite woman contemporary science fiction writer, and Levi Tidhar, who is very intercultural and interesting. So, and people I put up here as noteworthy writers, I didn't put up anybody who only wrote one famous book or story. I put up people here who wrote at least a couple very noteworthy novels or stories in the history of science fiction. So that's my list of the most noteworthy science fiction authors of all time, chunked in 3 different periods. Not in any particular order for any of the given lists. I would have to go back and say who was my favorite writer of the last 40 years. Maybe Ian McDonald, because he wrote 3 really good ones. Stephen Baxter would be another one. Or Neil Stevenson. 3 really great minds, the 3 of them. Okay, so the part I want to come to now is what is the value or values and purposes of science fiction? And I just quote from my volume 1 in my series that science fiction is the most visible, popular, and influential contemporary form of futurist thinking and imagination in the modern world. And so by that, I simply mean that if you ask people about the future and they give you just people on the street and they were to respond by giving you any kind of answers, the source of futurist imagination and thinking that they will most probably include will be stuff that's science fiction. Often science fiction movies, and in a lot of cases, science fiction movies don't measure up in terms of quality, but science fiction has a bigger impact on pop culture, on the general population, than any other form of futurist writing and thinking. It just really has been very influential over the last 100 years, roughly, since the time of Gernsback and Campbell. So why is it so popular? And this is my list of the values, the things about science fiction that make it so effective, make it so stimulating. First of all, it heightens holistic consciousness. It affects all aspects of consciousness, from thinking, imagination, emotion, values, aesthetics. It affects people in terms of their actions. It heightens all aspects of our consciousness. It's comprehensive in breadth, covers all the different themes and topics of reality. It's interdisciplinary and it integrates them all together. It's pluralistic, so you get lots of different visions and scenarios of the future, not any one. You get lots of different angles on it. It's evolutionary in that it both builds upon its past and it transcends its past. It keeps adding new elements, new themes, and it keeps growing from what it had from before. It is both a medium for entertainment and for artistic creation, synthesizes the two. It's a synthesis of both science and art. It's a synthesis of both the factual and the fictional modes of understanding. It's intended to be relatively scientifically credible, but also transcendent at the same time. Gernsback said science fiction educates and entertains at the same time. That was his thesis. It's a narrative form of understanding and experience, which resonates with the human mind because we resonate to the story more so than to the theory. If you want to engage a person's mind, give them a story. And that's what science fiction does. It presents its ideas in the form of stories. It synthesizes thought and emotion. That is, it synthesizes the rationalistic, objective, scientific with the romantic and the Dionysian. It pulls together our cognition and our affectivities. It, as far as emotion goes, it both stimulates and provokes hope and enthusiasm and fear and terror. So it goes from the dark side to the light side, okay? It stimulates both thinking and imagination and creates this expansive, flexible, cognitive space. That is, it opens up our cognitive awareness and capacity to think about different possibilities. And it pushes the boundaries of both philosophy and science and technology. It informs and it enlightens. It has a philosophical element. It has characters in it, which readers personally identify with. So it's not just simply abstractions, or it's not simply impersonal. That is, the ideas are presented through the eyes and experiences of characters, even if they're non-human. And because of its narrative form, its sensory detail, that it affects all aspects of consciousness, it makes the future feel real. It's not a abstract image, but it generates a realistic experience of a possible future. Vicarious, of course, but still feeling realistic. I have up this quote from Kim Stanley Robinson: "We're in a science fiction novel as a culture. Science fiction is the realism of today." Now, Arthur C. Clarke said a long time ago that science fiction in some ways may be an escape from reality, but it's probably more accurate to say that it's a deep dive into the fundamentals of reality. So even though it appears from a distance that when you go into science fiction, you're running away or you're escaping from the real world around you. When you go into science fiction, you're actually delving deeply into the fundamentals of reality. It's a unique mirror on the present. So we stand back from the present and we reflect on it and we extrapolate on it. Science fiction is often, in its futurist narratives, critiques on present trends. It's thought experiments. Does it predict the future? Lots of times it does. Campbell said that science fiction is a laboratory for the future. And in his mind, science fiction should take a leadership role in guiding human society, because it's through science fiction that we can, in narrative form, test out ideas about the future and its possibilities. It provokes freedom through its capacity to transcend. And in particular, Ursula Le Guin's thesis is that it provides us with innovative visions of the future that transcend the pessimism and entrapment of the present. And that was her vision of what science fiction is. So it pulls you out of the morass around you. It helps you to see other possibilities, gives you freedom. It facilitates and motivates the creation of the future. And that is, throughout its history, it has often stimulated in the minds of scientists and engineers and technologists technological creations. So it both reflects what's going on in the world and it provokes further evolution. In fact, it often provokes people into action through warnings and inspirations. A good example most recently about this would be Kim Stanley Robinson's Ministry of the Future, which is intended as a provocation to action in getting us to think about where we're heading with our ecological environmental reality and what we need to do differently to change it so that we in fact have a positive future. And finally, it keeps creating new symbols, icons, images, archetypes. And we have a need for the credible transcendent. This goes back to ancient religion, ancient mythology. And you could argue that science fiction takes the place of classical or ancient mythic and religious cosmic images. It provides a new credible transcendent. And then I got from Alexei Padshin in his history of science fiction. And science fiction, in that sense, definitely connects with mythology in that it provides us with a mythic narrative understanding of the future. So, on that note, I wanted to review, because I've mentioned this before, why do I think science fiction is the evolutionary mythology of the future? There's lots of commonalities between science fiction and myth. And up here on the screen, I list them. In my volume 1, I go into this in a lot more detail, but both myth and science fiction are narrative, personified, participatory, experiential, with archetypal themes and cosmic ontological ideas. They inspire, they have an emotional element, they deal with the fantastical, they connect the person with the cosmos. That is, in lots of ways, science fiction and myth are very similar in their functions and structural properties. And science fiction evolved from myth, opposing the mythic ontologies of the past, but continually incorporating them. So although science fiction emerges when science comes in and starts usurping the central authority of religion, science fiction has repeatedly taken ideas from ancient religion or classical religions and myths and incorporated them into its stories, both Eastern mythology and Western mythology. It reworks and retells classic myths, and it creates new ones. In fact, it provides paradigms of consciousness in the sense of ways of life, experience, ways of interpreting and directing our own lives. And I mentioned that back early on, that science fiction, in fact, provides science fiction fans with a way of life, a way of thinking, experiencing, dressing, talking, entertaining, does all of that. The themes of science fiction express our contemporary consciousness. So even though you could say, well, science fiction anticipates, predicts, looks out past our contemporary reality, science fiction frequently, often reflects the way we're thinking at the time, our consciousness, our knowledge of beliefs. And as society evolves, so does science fiction. So science fiction doesn't just provoke evolution, it also reflects the evolution in the world that's going on. And as I mentioned before, science fiction attempts to penetrate deep into reality like myths do. And so in summary, science fiction as myths, incorporating science, technology, and contemporary modes of understanding. It's myths about the future for the future. That is, we create myths about the future as a way to inspire us in our future evolution. So I have some questions at the end here, things to ponder. Are myths, and that includes science fiction myths, expressive of fundamental psychological frameworks of understanding or modes of experience in the human mind? And if they are, can these fundamental archetypes evolve? So it's a long-standing argument presented in psychology, philosophy too, that there are certain fundamental ideas or symbols or ways of thinking that are built into the human mind archetypally, okay? And myths express these, like love and death, and love and sacrifice, and wholeness and conflict, and order and chaos. Is this something that science fiction does? Do they express these archetypes? And if they do, can they evolve them? Now, the second question I have up here is the future, is reality best approached within a mythic consciousness versus an abstract theoretical consciousness, that is through mythos versus logos? And I would suggest that in this tension between the mythic and the logical is repeatedly integrated and evolves throughout our history. Whether we want to approach reality mythically, narratively, or theoretically abstractly. That goes back and forth in us. And as I've said, I use the concept of myth as a description for science fiction. And what are the pros and cons on that? And final question is, given the challenges of today, do we need new stories, new narratives, new myths for humanity? And I often see philosophers and writers on contemporary affairs arguing this, that we need new stories, new narratives. And my answer is that this is what science fiction provides. But science fiction can be very unnerving and very difficult and challenging because it pushes the conscious mind outside of its normal, everyday mode of thinking about reality. And is science fiction trying to work out new stories and ideas in this regard? And I would say yes. Now, a particular thing that I just wanted to highlight is that I think science fiction actually is involved in facilitating the purposeful evolution of our consciousness in the future. Science fiction stimulates holistic future consciousness, and it continually attempts to evolve and expand it, both our consciousness of the world around us and our inner self-consciousness. It has repeatedly involved itself into reinventing itself and evolving through, for example, the Golden Age and the Silver Age, or scientific romances to begin with, and horror and cyberpunk and the new weird. It's continually evolving itself. And it perpetually keeps presenting alternate realities and histories which expand our consciousness. In fact, in general, what it's doing is it's freeing up our consciousness, freeing up and stretching and breaking the constraints of tradition, normalcy, habit, authority. And science fiction fans and the huge global organization of science fiction fans is like a social, self-conscious think tank for evaluating and further creating new science fiction. In fact, I have up here a quote from Alexander von Thorn, that science fiction fandom is a community of the literature of ideas, the culture in which new ideas emerge and grow before being released into society at large. And science fiction fans among themselves and writers are continually talking about their stories, their ideas, and batting them around and stimulating each other, and people writing stories and novels based on that ongoing think tank kind of activity. And we got a little
I really couldn't tell you. I just kept trying things and then something worked.
Makes sense.
Tom, you have to unmute. Sorry about that.
Tom, you're still muted.
Okay, I'm unmuted, right? Right? Okay. All right. Sorry. Whatever happened there, although I didn't do it. Okay. So, the last 5-10 minutes, I just want to consider this question. How is science fiction going to evolve in the future? First thing we should note is science fiction in the past has evolved and continues to evolve. So it's an evolutionary genre. It doesn't stick to some particular set of ways of thinking and of topics that it's interested in. It keeps drawing in and revising its style, its themes. It repeatedly has reinvented itself. So it makes sense to think that it's going to continue to evolve in the future. And science fiction reflects the evolution of human consciousness. So we could ask ourselves, what specific future developments in human society may occur which would impact the ongoing evolution of science fiction? Because science fiction doesn't just provoke, it also reflects. I definitely think, as a trend that we've seen going on the last decade or two, that science fiction is becoming much more global in its participation, that there are an immense number of different fan groups all over the globe and an immense number of science fiction writers all over the globe from different countries, nationalities, who increasingly are part of the science fiction world. So although Great Britain, the United States, France, and Germany to some degree, and also you would have to include the Soviet Union too, have been the active initiators, leaders in science fiction. Science fiction now has spread throughout Asia, South America, Africa, and it's become a much more global phenomenon, and we could see that happening more so in the future. Now, a question up here, will the impact of science fiction on human consciousness increase in the future? Will it have an increasing impact on guidance and leadership in society? And stretching it, since its mythology will usurp the dominant role of classical religious myths, but often about the future, and classical religious myths about the future have a very central, influential role in people today. And then how will technological developments impact the future development of science fiction? Will science fiction, in fact, recently I read a story, just came out a few years ago, about a robot who becomes a member of science fiction fandom and starts to write and publish science fiction stories. And this is a story written by a human writing about a robot becoming a science fiction writer. So people worry about what's going to happen with the effects of general AI. One area is that science fiction, we may have robotic human syntheses generating science fiction. And then finally, what do we foresee as the future possibilities of science fiction in multimedia and literature and its relation with science and pop culture? As I said, it seems to me like science fiction is the mythology of the future. That is, the myths that will guide us in the future are going to come out of science fiction as opposed to where they come out of today. Okay, so just some final questions for you. Identify one or more stories and novels you had not previously read that you now plan on reading after completing this course. Okay, lots of people have been doing that all along. What important benefits or insights have you gained from this course? Thank you, Terry, for your comments. Has your holistic future consciousness evolved? And this is one that I would ask you to think about and get back to me on. This is the final episode, webinar, in the series, because I've come up now to the conclusion and summary of the whole thing and covered the entire history. But I had up there around 15 different main themes or topics in science fiction. And already did a special webinar on aliens. But would you be interested, and if you are, which ones, doing special webinars on a particular theme in science fiction? Less on me putting together elaborate slideshows, but more in terms of dialogue discussion. Would you like a webinar on time travel? Would you like a webinar on dystopias? A webinar on utopias? A webinar on robots and AI? On space travel, space colonization? We could do webinars in any of those topics in the future, which would have a specific focus. So I'll probably take a little break from doing this series, but if I hear from people on topics or themes that they would like to have roundtable discussions on, and we have collected together anywhere between a dozen and 2 or 3 dozen books for each of these themes, using them as the basis, we could talk about any of them if you wanted to. So that brings me to the conclusion and the end of this webinar on summary conclusions. And again, thank you, Terry. Terry provided most of the graphics on this webinar series as on the last one. And here's one of her more colorful, grandiose, flamboyant, fantastical visions that she produced over the last couple months. So anyway, thank you, Terry. And I'm going to end the webinar. No, I'm going to end my presentation. We can still talk. I'm going to stop sharing. In fact, we have a few minutes. If